morning. Okay, so today we're going to start our movie I told you about, and we're talking about love and life at the movies. We're going to watch a classic film. Have any of you ever watched a classic film before? You have? So classic film are generally older movies that are made in black and white, but don't disregard the film because it's in black and white. I think you're going to enjoy it. Most of the classes usually do. A little something to talk about with a classic film is when we had classic films, when classic films were made, these films had certain standards they had to meet. I don't know if you've noticed, but it seems like when you go to a movie today, pretty much anything goes. Language, nudity, sexual scenes, violence. You do not have that in the classic films. They had a certain code of ethics that they had to maintain in order for that film to be made and to be shown. So this is a classic film. There was what was called the Motion Picture Production Code, known as the Hays Code, and that was adopted on March 31st, 1930. And in this Hays Code, it said no picture shall be produced that will lower the moral standards of those who see it. So the story had to be an uplifting story overall that was in general of all films that were made during that time. The code had specific things to say about sexuality in the films. It said the sanctity of the institution of marriage in the home shall be upheld. Pictures shall not infer that low forms of sex relationships are accepted or the common thing. So basically, they emphasized the structure of the marriage and the family, and you didn't have adulterous relationships. Do you understand what I mean when I say an adulterous relationship? Relationships where people were having sex outside of marriage. That was a no-no in a classic film. It said a movie may be considered a classic film when it fulfills certain criteria, namely that it depicts universal truths in a way that is edifying to the viewer. Edifying means it builds the viewer up. It shows positive growth in virtue on the part of the major characters, transcends racial, ethnic, and religious boundaries and divisions. Classic films would present what we call a whole person romance, okay? So when you see a romantic relationship going on with someone, it wasn't a relationship where someone was only being used in a sexual manner like we see a lot today in films, okay? Because in a whole person context, the private nature of the sex act is recognized. You don't have graphic sexual activity in a classic film. Classic films portray sexual relations in marriage in a positive light and sexual relations outside of marriage in a negative light. In fact, if there was that type of relationship going on, they would only hint at it. They wouldn't actually show you what was going on. So, the name of our film is Roman Holiday, and we're going to talk about love and responsibility in the film. So, our stars of the film are Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck. Have you heard of these actors before?
Audrey Hepburn.
And how have you heard about Audrey Hepburn?
I don't know, I just heard about it.
She was in another very popular movie called Breakfast at Tiffany's. Have any of you heard of that? A lot of people know her from that. The entire movie was filmed on location in Rome, so that's really interesting because you get to see a lot of the buildings and the historical places that are still there in Rome. Okay, so we see Roman Holiday was nominated for 7 Academy Awards or Oscars and won 3. It's also nominated for Directors Guild of America Award and won the Golden Globe Award for Best Motion Picture Actress. So that was Audrey Hepburn. Roman Holiday was a screen debut for Audrey Hepburn, and it won her an Academy Award for Best Actress in a Leading Role. So this is a good film that was recognized by the Academy. Classic films are well worth watching again and again. We talked about classic films and how they're made. The film will be viewed in its entirety, and we're going to talk about the characters and analyze them as we're watching the film. Notice how the theme for this segment is reflected in the film. The glamorous life of wealth and fame is not always as wonderful as it appears. Okay, I want you to take out your journals And we're going to talk about some key terms in your journals. Look at page 19. If you don't have your journals, you can use a piece of paper. These are some key terms we're going to talk about. I want you to very quickly write down the definitions of these terms, and we're going to talk about how we see these terms played out in the first segment of the film. The terms are gracious, vulnerable, overwhelmed, and self-control. I'm going to give you just a little bit to write those down, and then we will start our movie. As we watch the film, we're going to talk about the relationships between the characters and about forming and maintaining healthy relationships. We're also going to talk about some timeless, universal values that were important in the day of the classic film that we're watching today. One of those being responsibility, and how that was important during the time that this film was made, and how responsibility in our relationships and in our actions is just as important today. So I'm going to go ahead and start the film because we want to make sure we see the entirety of our portion today. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the characters in our film so far. We have a couple of main characters. These were our key terms. We're going to talk about where we saw these terms played out in our film. Gracious, vulnerable, overwhelmed, self-control. So, who do we see in the film that was gracious? Where do we see that played out in our film?
Whenever that guy meets the princess,
When the guy meets the princess?
whatever she is.
So you think he's gracious? Okay, so what character traits did you see in the following characters? These are our main characters, Princess Anne, Joe Bradley, and Irving Radovich. And Irving is the other gentleman that's playing cards with Joe Bradley. So Princess Anne, what character traits did you see in them? And let's look at our terms: gracious, vulnerable, overwhelmed, and self-control. Does anybody have any thoughts on that with our key terms?
Princess Anne was overwhelmed with everyday life.
She was overwhelmed with the everyday life, right? So Princess Anne, we see she pretty much has everything going for her, but does she get to make her own decisions and do everything that she wants? No. She has a lot of responsibility. Does she look, how old do you think she is?
Like 19 or 18.
Maybe 18 or 19? So she's very young, but she has a lot of responsibility for a young girl. Okay. What about, we talked about gracious. Who do we see here that's gracious?
What was the guy's name? That was took her to his house.
Joe Bradley.
Well, Joe Bradley, he was gracious because he took Princess Anne home to his house when she was kind of sleepy and dizzy and she didn't feel good or anything.
So if she was sleepy and dizzy and didn't feel good, what other term might you think described her? Vulnerable, yes. So she was vulnerable. And she was vulnerable. Why was she vulnerable? What made her vulnerable?
The shot.
The shot, right. So during our film, Joe Bradley told her she shouldn't drink so much, right? But she wasn't drunk at all. The shot she took made her vulnerable. Okay, so we've talked about gracious. I think Princess Anne was gracious. Did you feel like she was gracious? Did you notice when all of the dignitaries came in and were presented to her, how she greeted each one of them in their own language? So she's obviously very well educated. She was able to greet them all in their own language. You know, she knew how to curtsy and bow and all those proper things. So she was definitely the epitome of graciousness. Vulnerable, we see that she's vulnerable once she had the shot. Overwhelmed, she was definitely overwhelmed in our film. Self-control, can somebody different answer for me? Who shows self-control in the film? Anybody? Joe Bradley. And where do we see him showing self-control?
Whenever they were in the bedroom
And what happened in the bedroom?
and she asked him to undress her.
Right.
He could have took advantage, but he decided not to.
So what did he do?
When he got caught.
He left.
He left. He removed himself from the situation because she obviously was very willing to let him take her clothes off at that point in time. So we saw him exhibit self-control there. There was also another point in the film where Joe Bradley exhibited self-control. Can anybody else think of that?
The taxi part? Was it that?
Not the taxi. I'm thinking of one other situation.
When he was at the table with all the men?
When he was at the card table, right. And what did he do there?
He stopped playing.
He stopped playing cards and he left while he still had some money in his pocket. He could have continued to play and lose all his money, but he went ahead and left the game. So we saw self-control exhibited there. Go ahead. So we see Princess Anne is obviously a wealthy celebrity. Name some of the things that she has.
She lives in a castle.
Right. We see her laying in her bed. She's looking around the room and she's looking at all the molding and the statues and all the things in the castle. So she lives in the castle, and then what else do we see? She has someone that's basically at her beck and call, right? She has a lady in waiting that dresses her and brings her a snack and tells her schedule and just basically does everything for her.
Basically a maid.
Right, like a maid or... So she has everything in the world. It says, why is she unhappy even though she has all of these things?
She is unhappy because she has all these people telling different things. She has to do this and that, and she can't even decide for her own what she wants to do.
Right. I mean, she even talked about she didn't want to wear the old nightgown anymore, right? She's a young girl, and even though she's a young girl, she's not able to experience life as a normal young person. Remember how she ran to the window and she looked out onto the street and saw the people dancing, and you know, she just wants to get out and enjoy life without being so formal all the time. Okay, so we saw this discussion here where Anne says, is this the elevator? And Joe Bradley said, it's my room. So what is significant in this scene when Joe takes Anne to his apartment for the night? Why do you think they had that discussion? Why would she ask that? Is this the elevator?
Because the room was moving.
Okay, you think because the room was moving? Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
She is used to a big place and going from floor to floor.
Well, and maybe that's the smallest room she's ever been in. I don't know. You know, that room was very small compared to her bedroom. Looked like his entire apartment was probably the size, maybe even smaller than his entire apartment. So she thought his room was the elevator. Okay, so notice how the theme for this segment is reflected in the film. Exercising self-control with members of the opposite sex is necessary for trust in a relationship. And so we saw that played out with Joe Bradley, and we talked about that. He had the opportunity to take advantage of Princess Anne. He had a beautiful young woman in his room. She obviously was very vulnerable at the time, but instead of taking advantage of the situation, he could have had his way with her. He removed himself from the situation. So this is something we can think about in our own lives, especially you as young people. You're going to be in situations where, you know, I remember being young and being in high school and being in college, and maybe you go to a party, and you may not be so much at this age in high school, but if you decide to go on to college and once you're in your 20s, you go to a party, there may be people who are drinking, there may be people who are smoking things that may make them vulnerable. And we oftentimes see this situation as a time where someone gets taken advantage of. So this is where we have to search ourselves and decide whether or not we are going to be men and women of integrity. Okay, remember we've talked about that, about integrity in our last lesson. Just like Joe Bradley, he decided to be a man of integrity. He took himself out of the situation. He also decided to be a man of integrity when he brought her home to keep her safe so she wasn't laying on the street and somebody else could take advantage of her. Also, what's important is maybe not let yourself get in that situation of being in that vulnerable state, because you don't always know that the person that you're with will be a person of integrity and will protect you if you are in such a vulnerable state. So it's another way to think about things. Okay, so we have two more key terms for our next segment. Go ahead and jot down these definitions on page 20. Modesty and opportunist. Modesty and opportunist. Modesty is the virtue of keeping private that which should be private, such as one's body, certain language, etc. An opportunist is a person who takes advantage of an opportunity to achieve his or her own personal goals without care or consideration for how this might hurt others. So go ahead and jot down these terms, and we're going to see where these terms play out in our next segment. At this point in the film, do you like the characters? Do you like Princess Anne? And do you like Joe Bradley? Do you think he's a good guy?
So far.
We're going to continue to see, as our characters develop, how the different terms, how we see those terms play out in our characters, and we'll continue to analyze them throughout the rest of today's segment and in next week's segment. So modesty and opportunist. I want you to watch how these terms play out in our film, and we'll watch the last half of today's film. Okay, guys, modesty and opportunist. Where do we see modesty portrayed in this second segment? I think when she woke up in the apartment, and when we first started this segment, how did she conduct herself? When she woke up and she realized, she covered up. Did you notice how she looked down at first when she realized she had pajamas on? All of a sudden she reached down to see what she had on underneath the covers. And then when she went in the bathroom, how did she walk into the bathroom? She had full-length pajamas on. She had the bedspread of the bed over her, and then she backed into the bathroom. So she definitely displayed modesty there. Opportunist. Who do we see that's an opportunist here? Joe Bradley. Joe Bradley. So now that he's realized that she's a princess, what is he after? The money. He's after a story. So we said we liked him, that he exhibited self-control. He seemed like someone that we could trust in the first section of the film, but now he told her when he left in the first segment, he said, you know, he left the room when she asked him to help her get undressed. He left the room so that he would leave that situation since she was so vulnerable at that point. He exhibited the self-control, but he said sleep on the couch, right? He slept in the bed. Now that he's found out that she's a princess, what did he do? He picked her up and he put her in the bed so that when she woke up, she thought that she slept in the bed all night. So she thinks he's someone that she can trust. But we're seeing he's more of a complex character, right? We like him. He took care of her in her vulnerable state, but at the same time now he's after a story. Okay, so we saw Princess Anne, Joe Bradley, and Irving Radovich again. It says, Anne is alarmed as any girl would be to find herself in a strange man's apartment after having spent the night there. Anne realizes, however, that Joe took her off the street and gave her a place to stay without taking advantage of her. Because he exercised self-control when she was most vulnerable, she knows she can trust him. But even though she trusts him, does she give him her true identity when they introduce herself? No. So how do we see that he's a complex character? What virtues and flaws do we see in him? And we talked a little bit about that already. Anybody have any thoughts?
He owes debt to a lot of people.
He owes a debt to a lot of people? Okay. And what do you think? I mean, he told the landlord he couldn't pay him. He was 2 months behind in the rent. But then how do you think that situation looked when the young lady, the landlord sees this pretty young lady walking out of the apartment and he's handing her money in the morning? How do you think that looked? Didn't look very good. And the lady who came in to clean the apartment, she obviously jumped to a conclusion. What did she think when she saw the bed was a mess and it was the middle of the day and the curtains are all drawn and then there's a young lady in the apartment in the bathroom, and started chastising her, right? Okay, so we saw this discussion. Have I been here all night alone? If you don't count me, yes. So I've spent the night here with you. Oh, well, now I don't know if I'd use those words, but from a certain angle. Why does she feel like she can trust him? Because he didn't take advantage of her, right? So she really does feel like she can trust him, but she doesn't give him her real name. So it says, notice how the theme for this segment is reflected. Honesty is an essential element of true friendship. So on both sides here, we see that really here at the end, neither one of them are being honest.